Good evening, all. Welcome to the third session of the online lecture series on research methodology and academic writing, hosted by the Research and Postgraduate Department of English, Sree College, Kalady, in collaboration with College IQAC. Today, we have with us Dr. Kunhammad K K, Assistant Professor, Department of Studies in English, Kannur University. May I invite Dr. Preeti Nair, IQAC Coordinator and Research Guide of our department to offer welcome address. Over to you, ma'am.
Good evening and a warm welcome to the online webinar series on research methodology and academic writing. Today is the third of the 4 lecture series conducted by the Research and Postgraduate Department of English in association with IQAC, Sree College, Kalady. We have with us today an eminent scholar, Dr. Kunhammad K K, as a resource person. With more than 28 years of teaching experience at different universities, including University of Calicut, Kannur University, and University of Sharjah, he has many publications to his credit. His areas of specialization are literary theory, cultural studies, Indian writings in English, fiction, poetry, and ELT. Sir, with utmost respect, I welcome you to the program. I also welcome all the participants, dear friends, colleagues, and scholars to the webinar. Thank you and welcome once again. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So without much ado, let me invite Dr. Kunhammad K K for his lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Let me open my presentation. Okay. See my presentation. Can you see my presentation yet? No.
Yes, sir. The screen is visible, but not as PPT presentation.
Okay. It says presenting, but I don't know. Can you see it now? No?
Yes, sir. We see your screen, sir.
No, you can't see my presentation slides?
The slides are not in the presentation mode, sir, but the slides are visible.
That's okay. I can change that.
Okay, sir.
Is it okay now?
Yes, sir.
Is it clear? Is it full?
Yes, sir.
Full view now, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Okay. Yeah. I'm really thankful to the organizers of this webinar series for inviting me over, for giving me this opportunity. As you all know, I'm supposed to do my presentation tomorrow, but an unforeseen exigency has forced me to do this today for the sake of my friend. As you can see from the title, the title given to me is Philosophy, Ethics, and, some other fundamentals of research. Now, usually on research methodologies syllabi, we don't find philosophy and ethics as a separate component. So I was really, amused when I saw this, and it's really a very good thing because now I think the university UGC is insisting on courses on ethics. For somehow, um, despite the fact that philosophy, the term philosophy, is very common, or is constant, has always been used in, for instance, we have a Master of Philosophy, which we call MPhil. We know that it's not a reference to the course content or of the discipline of philosophy. So today, when I talk about philosophy, I'll be talking about philosophy in that broad sense. We have an MA, Master's, course, Master of Arts in English, MA in English. Then we have Master of Philosophy in English. Then we have Doctor of Philosophy in English. In other words, at some point, at the point of research, as we enter the frontier of research, our MA, our arts course becomes a philosophy course. How does that happen and why does that happen? In what sense are we using the word philosophy there in that particular context? In what sense is a literary researcher or a humanities researcher or any researcher for that matter, because they're all called doctors of philosophy, in what sense are they philosophers? This sense of philosophy, is what we are going to talk about. It implies several things. It implies a sense of rigorous thinking, a sense of critical thinking, creative thinking in a particular area. So there are multiple dimensions to the concept of philosophy here. One easy way to understand how we become, or we are expected to become philosophers, can be, seen in this particular shift from MA to MPhil and PhD, where philosophy becomes an important aspect of it. George Simmel, in one of his books, I think it's in the book The Philosophy of Money, talks about two aspects of any discipline, two kinds of studies. One is, at the fundamental basic level, and the other is at the research level. At the research level, when you look at any discipline at the research level, you become a philosopher of the discipline. We use money, as Simmel points out. But we are not philosophers of money. We never think about how money works. We take money for granted. But when you talk about the philosophy of money, you actually do a different kind of thinking about it. So we'll be looking at it. I will not be talking about philosophy in its usual sense. I will not be speaking about the normal, I will not be invoking any of the normal philosophers, so-called philosophers, Western or Eastern. I will be talking about philosophy to show how it really, impacts literature, how it literary research, how it influences literary research. Am I audible? Is anything wrong with the voice? Or is somebody else talking? Okay. So let us get into it. The topic, as you can see, implies that philosophy and ethics are fundamentals. So there's no point in saying the philosophy, ethics, and the fundamentals of research because they're also fundamental. Let's see how they work. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, the Japanese concept of ikigai. At least some of you might be familiar with it. Ikigai is a Japanese term, and it means reason for being. You know, Iki means reason and Guy means being. When I thought about, talking about the philosophical dimension of research, when we talk about the philosophical dimension of research, you know, one way of communicating that idea, one way of taking a philosophical view of what we do as researchers would be to actually focus on our reasons. Why are we, I don't know, is it a problem with the teams, or is it, the team software, I'm using it for the first time, the format. So the disturbances, is it from my computer? Anjana, is it from my computer or is it from?
I guess one of the participants just unmuted. Here is a request to all of you, please mute your audio while the.
Participants, please mute your audios, and because I'm not familiar with Teams. This is I think Team takes a lot of bandwidth. I mean, it requires a lot of
Yes,
data.
sir.
So
Yes, sir.
whenever a disturbance is coming, I'm worried whether it is a problem with the system. So if I'm not audible, please let me know. Okay. So when we talk about research, we are talking about life. So Ikigai presents a beautiful way of looking at what we do, what we specialize in. As a teacher, the first question, probably anybody who is engaged in some kind of work, you could be a doctor, a lawyer, or a teacher. The first question we need to ask is whether we are we are good at something. We'll talk about this at length a little later on. I mean, we try to. There is this whole idea of identifying our aptitude, identifying, the area in which we are really good at, area at which we are good. The point is, if you really want to be good, if you want to really do something, you need to love what you do, right? And I think Khalil Gibran has beautifully put that in his classic, The Prophet. Work is love made visible. In other words, if you are doing some kind of work, you need to love it. And loving the work is not enough. You need to be good at it. I mean, you need to choose an area in which you have some skills, or you need to develop some skills. So the first thing that we need to think about is whether, and we need to identify what we love to do. And then we develop skills in it. We become good at doing that. And then we ask ourselves, does the world need what I'm good at? Is that skill something that the world needs? So what happens is, when you have passion for something, that passion is translated into a particular skill area. And when you develop that passion, when you work according to that passion, you gradually become good at it, and you think of accepting that as a profession, as a career. So, but as you continue to love it, at some point you find it difficult not to relate it to a task that is assigned to you by probably the society. That is the stage where you ask yourself whether the world needs what I'm doing. That is the stage where you identify yourself with a mission. What I'm talking about is right now the philosophy. I'm not talking about, and therefore it actually, applies to all fields of knowledge. This is not just about literature or research in literature. We need to identify an area that we love, and we need to develop our skills and become good at doing that. And we need to find out at some point of time whether what we do could actually fulfill some needs of the society, of the world. And also we need to think about whether we can, make money out of it and earn a living out of it. So a complex, combination of passion, mission, profession, and vocation. And vocation, remember, is very important. Vocation is, basically, it is the idea that you are destined to do something. I'm sure you're familiar with professional training and vocational training. Vocational training is usually done, when we are, usually at the adolescent stage. I mean, it's because everybody at some point of time, probably at that point of time, if you really, listen to the person, if you really do some kind of test, you would be able to make out what the person's profession is. What profession are you cut out for? What job are you cut out for? Or what exactly is your destiny? Again, you can invoke Khalil Gibran here, where Khalil Gibran says that he talks about the dream of the earth, and all of us, all human beings, being assigned a particular task to further that dream, the earth's dream. We are part of it. We have been assigned that task right from early on. This is what philosophy does to us. Philosophy takes us away from our limited domains and, you know, make us look at the world from a much larger perspective. Vocation, to understand vocation, it would be, useful to go to Fichte. Fichte is a extremely popular lecture series called The Vocation of the Scholar, where he talks about the relation between the scholar and the society. That's where vocation comes in. You don't have to, even if you're not part of a mission, are you aware of the fact that what you're doing is essential for the society in some sense? According to Fichte, the vocation of the scholar is acquisition of knowledge, is to impart knowledge, is to receive knowledge, is to remain open to new knowledge, new domains of knowledge, and also the readiness to communicate that knowledge to other people. This is our fundamental vocation. This is our vocation. This is the philosophy of what we do. This is the philosophy, as Spivak often reminds us, right? Outside in the teaching machine, when you're able to go outside, but still within the teaching machine, this is what we think about. If you're caught within the wheel, within the structure, within the teaching machine, as she puts it, we are never able to get the philosophical dimension of what we're doing, the vocational dimension of what we're doing. So the scholar is destined in a peculiar manner for society. So his class, more than any other, exists only, because the society exists, for the society. So ikigai, is something that gives us a sense. Let's look at it a little deeply here. So if you love something, you are passionate about it, at some point you will probably develop a profession out of it, because without a profession, you won't be paid, and you need to be paid for something. But then how is it possible? How can we actually, relate our life to the lives of others? How can we connect with others? Ikigai tells us that, this is your reason for being. If you don't have a reason for being, when do you lose your reason for being? The raison d'etre, as it is, often, as it is often referred to in a French corruption. A very common French usage. Raison d'etre. Why do we exist? Why are we here? When we do something with passion, we understand the missionary dimension of it, and we do it in a professional manner, as if it is our destiny, then we experience a sense of fullness. This is perhaps one philosophical dimension of any kind of profession. But if you have only passion and profession, right? A lot of people are like that. They're passionate about what they do, but they don't accept the mission, accept it as a mission. They don't care about what the world needs, whether the world needs what they do at all, right? They just do it because they're passionate about it and they're professional about it, right? But when they're related to the larger, all those, I can give you any number of examples. Think about, MBBS training centers, right? Those people are passionate, they're extremely professional, and they're able to get lots of people admitted into the course. What is their mission exactly? Creating everyone or turning everyone into doctors? What exactly do they think their destiny is? So if you have only passion and profession, you're going to feel satisfied, but you will feel a sense of meaninglessness, a sense of you would ask the question, what exactly am I doing once in a while in your life? And if you have only passion and mission, right, but you don't think about a profession, it's going to be difficult because you're going to be delighted, you're going to be full, but you will always have problems of an economic nature, of a financial nature. If you have only mission and vocation, but no real passion and professional approach to it, then there are problems. There is excitement, there again, there will be uncertainty, they say. If you have only profession and vocation, you're not worried about passion and mission. I mean, you won't be a good teacher, by the way. I mean, you will feel comfortable. These are different levels of engagement, by the way. And the most fundamental lesson of research is that if you're not really engaged fully, don't do research. You don't need to. You don't need to do research, to get a job. Research is something that we do because we love to do it. I'm aware as a teacher that many of us are doing it as a qualification. That is the reason why we have this new phenomenon of the mass production of PhDs is because it has become an essential, or it is going to become an essential qualification, not because a lot of people love it. That's the danger. The philosophical dimension will disappear when it becomes a basic qualification for a job. And that's happening. I'm not blaming the students, but for us to save ourselves, to salvage something out of this whole experience of preparing ourselves for a job, is to actually develop a certain passion. So when you choose a topic, you need to consider this. When you choose an area or domain, you need to consider this. It may not be always difficult. It may not always be easy to sort of understand the research that you're doing in terms of a mission, to look at it in terms of a vocation and so on. But this experience of a calling, the feeling that this is my calling, this is my vocation, that is a very empowering, powerful feeling. And if we have that, we will continue to develop. That's what Fichte says. Fichte says, a scholar has to continue to acquire knowledge. There's no limit. There's no limit. We will actually have an opportunity to talk about it. Here, what we are talking about is basically levels of engagement. At what level are you operating? These are usually considered to be the 6 levels. And these levels indicate your application of the 4 dimensions of yourself, your personality, your mind, your heart, your body, and your spirit. We understand the difference, Some people, whenever they're given a task to do, they have a tendency either to rebel or quit. But when we are a government employee, quitting is not an option, unless, of course, there are people who do that. People who realize that this is not what they love, what they want to do. But others, they just rebel. They come up with some kind of excuse not to do their work, their job. Then there are people who are obedient in a malicious sense. People who are totally You know, they're obedient. They're doing it because they're obedient. That's the only reason they're doing it. Then this obedience is malicious. The person who's giving you the order, you don't like that order. You don't like that person at all. You do it because you think that it'll have consequences on your job. That's the only reason you do it. The next stage, the next level of engagement is willing compliance. And we somehow manage with such people. You can actually categorize people in your own colleges based on these levels of engagement. Cheerful cooperation is at least what we need for a healthy living. You can always take it up. You can take it up to heartfelt commitment. You can take it up to finally creative excitement. That is where creativity begins. We'll have opportunity to talk about creativity at length a little later. As research scholars and as people working in colleges and universities, as you all know, like me, I'm sure all of us know, we need to ask ourselves, at different stages in our life, due to different commitments, due to different family and other situations, or unexpected setbacks, we are forced to reduce levels of engagement. It could be a financial crisis. It could be someone sick at home. It could be something else. But, that is normal. That it is impossible to remain at the top of full engagement throughout. But there are people who live their entire career without engagement, in willing compliance. And if you don't like this profession, if a group of people don't like a particular profession, I mean, now changing career shift is very easy. You don't really, because this is going to have significant impact on you. At a certain stage in your life, let's say in your early 40s, it depends. I think in the new gen, it's even earlier. The question of meaning arises. And the question of meaning arises precisely because you're not engaged. When you're fully engaged, when you're spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically engaged, heart, body, mind, and spirit, that is the level at which we become the healthiest of human beings, in not only in personal terms but also in social terms. So that's just a I would say an introductory remark on how we need to look at the entire question of research and why we do it from a broad perspective. Now what I'm going to do is to use a particular textbook by um, um, a famous educational expert, a scientist, and I think someone you're all familiar with, Howard Gardner. Howard Gardner is a you know very famous scientist who literally uh, became a sensation with his publication of the book Frames of Mind. When he, I'm sure you're familiar with it, when he literally invented the concept of multiple intelligences. He spoke about, you know, say, but later on, after that, he wrote several books. I think almost 50, more than 50 books is published. And the book that I'm going to look at, which I'm going to use as a framing, narrative or a device for the rest of the talk, uh, is Five Minds for the Future. It's a book you should take a look at, and it's a beautiful book. It suggests, as you can see from the title, that we don't have one mind. We have five minds. And he calls each one of these, with a particular name. The disciplined mind, the synthesizing mind, the creating mind, the respectful mind, the ethical mind. So in order to design a culture of full engagement, of creative engagement, we need to, we can use the framework offered by Gardner. This framework is very powerful because it addresses most of the problems that our researchers, suffer from. Let's start with the disciplined mind. How do we develop a disciplined mind? But before that, we need to know exactly what a disciplined mind is. I'm sure you're aware of the two common two or three meanings of the word discipline. First, the common meaning is, of course, what we think of every time we think of discipline in a school or at home. Discipline is understood usually as a negative thing, as something that prevents you from doing something. We think of the carrot and stick. We think of punishments we received when we think about discipline. We're not talking about discipline in that sense. We're talking about discipline from a much wider, let's take the other two uses. There are actually three uses. The other two uses, one is we say literature is a discipline. So discipline there means a branch of study. We also say that we need a disciplined mind. In other words, discipline in its first sense refers to a systematic study of a particular branch of knowledge. And discipline also means the nature of disciplined work, hard work. In fact, those two terms are extremely. There is one more meaning, actually, which has become very common now with the publication of Peter Senge's famous book, The Fifth Discipline. There he's using the word discipline in a slightly different sense. Senge means, by the word discipline, a level of mastery of a particular discipline at which you are able to put your knowledge into practice. So discipline, in that sense, is a skill that you've mastered because of your continuous dedication to a discipline of knowledge with a lot of discipline, dedication, hard work, and so on. So if you look at the three meanings of the word, you understand what it takes to become disciplined or to develop a disciplined mind. You need to identify in a particular domain that you're doing research, the most important concepts, we call them threshold concepts within the discipline, and learn, focus on them, understand them. I mean, you need to make sure that you need to use secondary materials. You need to go to the original, then come back to the secondary material, probably tertiary materials, and understand those concepts well. That's the only way you can have a discipline. They say that true mastery of a discipline takes about 10,000 hours of your lifetime. That's the time they say. Probably in the new gen, system, you take much less. But 10,000 hours is something like 20 years if you spend 3 hours a day. That's how you master a particular discipline, they say. Whatever the discipline is, if it's literature, it has its own master concepts, threshold concepts. You have to identify them, then spend a significant amount of time on that particular topic that you're interested in, that you love, and that you think you can be good at. Gradually, over a period of time, you will find the mission through your passion. And then at some point, you will realize that this is what I'm destined to do. That's vocation. Now you can approach the topic once you are, you have to approach the topic in a variety of ways. And then you also, they say, set up performances of understanding. That is what I mean by the fourth meaning of the word, discipline, where you prove through performance that you've understood that concept, whatever the concept is. You give examples. You put them in practical life examples. Good teachers always do that. They're able to relate concepts, to real life experiences. These are performances of understanding. Now, disciplining the mind requires or makes sure that you have a discipline. So all of us, I think most of us are actually, I understand, we are working in the discipline of literature. How many of us can say that we have a certain level of mastery of the discipline. We can cite excuses, even in the area. Suppose you're specialized in, let's say, a minor area, like Indian writings in English. Is there an end to mastery? No. The more you master, the more you begin to feel that you have yet to master. So mastery, there is no end of the road. There's no end of the road. But you keep identifying truly important concepts within the discipline, and you begin to learn the discipline. The second mind that we need to learn. So as researchers, in today's research culture, we don't see this very often. We use shortcuts, as a result of which we begin to, enter into the unethical domains. The problem is because we are not interested in carrying out hard work, disciplined work. So in order to master a discipline, we need to develop the attitude of discipline, systematic work. That's important for our research. And what exactly is synthesizing? For you to be here now, look at what Bill Bryson is saying in an interesting book called A Short History of Nearly Everything. For you to be here, trillions of drifting atoms had somehow to assemble in an intricate and intriguingly obliging manner to create you. People are worried about copying stuff. But what exactly do we mean by synthesis? It's an important skill, especially today. At a time when it's impossible, it's more difficult to get rid of information than to get information. Synthesizing becomes an extremely important skill. One objection often raised when trying to achieve mastery in a field is this, that there's so much to cover. When we talk about literature, we say there is an entire shelf of books on Shakespeare. Not Shakespeare. On Shakespeare, there are multiple shelves. On T.S. Eliot, on the wasteland, there is a shelf of books. How do we read them? The old methods don't work anymore. We need to capture the essence of a multiple, set of books and resources, and we need to produce a new synthesis. Think about, suppose you want to study Indian history. How many books are available on Indian history? Why do we have hundreds of textbooks on a single concept, on a single topic? Even if I think most of you will have at least some books on history of Kerala, on history. You just walk into any Malayalam bookshop, and if you want to study Indian history, there are several histories, Why? Because each textbook or each book represents a new synthesis, a new way of organizing information, arranging information. It's an arrangement so specialized and particular that it has never been tried before and will only exist this once. Look at the second part. For researchers of today, synthesizing is an extremely essential, skill. But synthesizing, remember, is not copying. Nobody would actually publish a book in the exact same way as somebody else. But that would be not only plagiarism, and there's no point in doing that. We have hundreds of poets, probably thousands of poets, but we know that each poet that we talk about has written poetry, even if the topic is the same, in a different way. So the synthesis that every thesis, for instance, every PhD thesis is an arrangement which is specialized in a certain way, and also particular because two new issues are, highlighted. Probably old issues are allowed to recede to the background. What happens is at the end of it, your PhD thesis or your MPhil thesis becomes a specialized arrangement, and a particular arrangement, not a universal one, not something that you can see anywhere else. That is That is synthesizing. So synthesizing, there are problems. We'll talk about the problems that we experience while synthesizing. Synthesizing goes by, very bad names now. We take ideas from others and we use it as our own. That's not synthesizing. So synthesizing skill is extremely important. To go back to the topic of philosophy, I would like you to, take a look at this to understand synthesizing. One of the most beautiful definitions of philosophy, the aims of philosophy, the aim of philosophy by Wilfrid Stellars. The aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things hang together. It is important. This is a philosophical perspective towards things. Whenever you're looking at something, whenever you're reading a number of books, one problem most of our research scholars have is they read, and they never write. I always insist on writing them down. I tell them, please write down. You read a novel, I ask my students, when they read a novel, I ask them to write 20 to 30 pages on the novel on finishing it. Because it is when you write, when you sit down to write, that you begin to understand how things hang together. Things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. Because in the broadest possible sense of the term, things would also include human beings. This is a definition. It's a beautiful definition. Of course, the most recent philosophers of triple O, like object-oriented ontology, philosophers of object-oriented ontology and the new so-called new materialists object to this kind of definitions because they think that you cannot really bring everything under the umbrella of things, because things have a life of their own, right? The famous books like Social Life of Things, and the books like Vibrant Matter, books like Alien Phenomenology, these kind of textbooks, and would object to this kind of a definition because they believe that objects have their own ontology, their own existence. But here, what Stellars does is to bring together everything. Human beings are things in the broadest sense. Things in the sense that you can touch them, they're tangible. So synthesizing is this ability. Synthesizing is its capacity, right? Taxonomy is a synthesis. When you talk about the narrative of a novel, what are you doing? You're synthesizing. Narrative synthesis. I don't want to talk, more about it, because if you go into Deleuze, you have passive synthesis, active synthesis that happens normally, right? Every act of perception is an act of synthesis, synthetic act, right? Now you're looking at, if you're interested in the lecture that's going on here, I'm sure you're looking at a computer screen. And you are looking at the computer screen or your phone screen while there are lots of other objects in the background. But your perception has picked only those things that you're interested in. So the act of perception is a synthetic act in that sense. That's an important skill that we all have. We center our perception on one particular thing. And in order to do that, we need to know how things hang together. How one thing can be distracting, one thing can be, So synthesizing, in one sense, is a concept, is an idea embedded within the very concept of philosophy. That is where philosophy becomes important. And this is what we are expected to do once we finish our MA and embark on research. You're doing an MA program, right? You're doing you're doing an MA program. Somebody's sending me a message. Abhijit is asking me to control or something. Stop presenting. Can I continue? Is that some message for me?
No, sir, you may continue.
Okay. I just got a pop-up message here,
Participants, please don't request control.
Something like that, yeah. Anyway, as long as it is not addressed to me, right? Please address to me whatever you want to address orally, okay? So, um, you know, when we are today, our students are doing, for example, at the MA level, if you look at our own syllabi, at the university, at Kannur University, they're doing culture studies is one paper, Indian writing in English is another paper, and they have literary theory, they have, probably language, history of language, all kinds of things. They study them as separate. Some of the students do film studies, some others do culture studies, and it's possible for a culture studies student to know that film studies probably doesn't fall under culture studies. They never know how things hang together. Research is what helps you understand how things hang together in the domains, in the field of study that you've chosen. So synthesizing is an amazing skill that we need to develop. And all of us have this skill. All of us use this skill, utilize this skill when we are doing research. We do this naturally, right? We naturally do this. There's a human tendency. There's always a human tendency to sort of understand things in their totality by relating things to things. It's always there. Now, how to develop a creating mind? The second part of my presentation would almost exclusively be focused on creativity to a certain extent. But look at Howard Gardner's quotes here. The acid test for creativity is simply stated: has the domain in which you operate been significantly altered by your contribution? A lot of people ask this question, is there creativity in your research? The reason why I've used these quotes is because I want you to clearly understand how creativity is different, or how why you don't really need to worry too much about creativity. How many of us are capable of producing a certain research which significantly changes the entire domain? Very few. How many of us are scientists, real creative, so-called Einsteins and so on? Teachers of philosophy are actually teachers of philosophy. They teach philosophy their entire life. They teach philosophy without ever becoming a philosopher. We teach science without becoming scientists. We teach poetry without ever becoming a poet. Creativity, if you see creativity, if you see that a particular work is creative, I can give you any number of examples of creative research. There is, right? The example of Wittgenstein's thesis is, PhD thesis, right, is one really funny example, right? He didn't do any PhD. He just wrote a book, and since Bertrand Russell and his friends wanted to give him a job, they decided to make that part of his research work, and he was interviewed for that. That was pure creativity, actually, real creative work. But then when you produce a creative work in that way, you change the domain in which you're operating. A new poet will actually tell us how poems could be written in new ways. That kind of creativity is very, very, very limited and not very sustainable. Look at the second sentence. No society can be composed entirely of creators. They are by nature destabilizing. Creative people are destabilizers of society because they change the game, they change the goalpost, they change rules of the game. We can't afford to do that every now and then. We need a syllabus to work on, right? I remember when I was an MA student, T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land was there on the syllabus. And I was told at the time that it has been there for quite some time. almost 30 or 40, 30 years, later now, it's still on the syllabus. If everybody is creative, if every syllabus setter is creative, if every policymaker is absolutely creative, we will have real problems. It's very destabilizing. So don't feel guilty if you think your work is not creative enough. That's good. That's what, that only tells you that you don't, unfortunately or fortunately, you don't belong to the 1% or the 2% of the total population. It's not something you need to feel guilty about. It is something that you need to completely forget and think of your mission, think of your vocation, think of what you could do to the society that exists instead of changing that society. The way, things are understood, right? So, really creative people they try to understand how things hang together, but they do that in order to make sure that things cannot hang together in that way. They should actually be organized in a different way. That's how they look at it. They're disturbed by the status quo, disturbed by how things go. How to develop the respectful mind. I think these are things we all know. We must love one another or die. That particular quote expresses the whole idea, I think. A truly respectful individual offers the benefit of the doubt to all human beings. How do we respect others? The problem here is the problem of the other. Not only research, every activity involves other people. On being with other people is an extremely crucial skill. How do you, when you're doing research, when you're engaged, for instance, when you're defending a thesis, or when you're defending a paper, when you're presenting a paper, you need to respect everyone. You need to respect others. You need to, this is what Fichte says in his book, The Vocation of the Scholar. Even the greatest experts, the so-called experts, need to remember that the ordinary man may know something that the expert has probably had never looked at. He has to respect. This respect is openness. It is the practice of giving the benefit of doubt to all human beings. It doesn't matter what, but you have to do that. You never know, right, how much the other person knows. It's funny at times, people will immediately, because everybody tries to relate their field of study to your field of. I had a very funny experience probably about 20 years ago when I was, no, not even, when I was doing my PhD in Hyderabad University. I was on a train. I had this book by Sartre called Nausea with me. And as I was just reading that book, standing actually inside the train, someone just asked me if he could have a look at the book. And he looked at the book, and I thought, I was struggling to understand the book. I didn't know what the book. I mean, this existentialist stuff. I was somehow caught by the existentialist bug at the time, reading a lot of Camus and so on. And when I started reading Nausea was really nauseating in the sense that you couldn't understand it. Then suddenly I found this guy who was interested in Nausea, and I thought probably he's a philosopher. I just gave him the book and kept quiet for a while. After a while, he gave me the book back. And I wanted to somehow start the conversation with him about the book. And he said, no, I just took the book because I'm a medical representative, and I see this word many, many times, on many occasions on the cover of, medicines and so on. So for him, that is a different kind of nausea. But you have to give him the benefit of the doubt. Who knows who that is? You respect the other person and imagine that he's is an expert. That kind of a culture is fast disappearing now. Now, Mr. Know-alls proliferate everywhere. And, what they call, arrogance, ego with ignorance. That's what they call arrogance, right? That's what we have. I don't need to know what you know. The whole notion of post-truth is based on that idea. I know what I'm saying is right because I believe, is what the famous British, Prime Minister said. I know that it is true because I believe it. You don't believe something because it is true. You think it is true because you believe it. This is another definition of philosophy. A definition which Heidegger quotes and discusses at the beginning of his, monumental introduction to metaphysics. That book begins with a discussion of philosophy as homesickness. Philosophy is, properly speaking, homesickness, the wish to be at home everywhere. I think this is an amazing definition of philosophy. If you're a philosopher, a lot of philosophers love to travel around and go around and see how people live in other worlds, other parts of the world. They are comfortable everywhere. In other words, philosophy as homesickness is a kind of perspective on life where the other is not perceived as a threat. The other is loved. Whenever you reach a stranger's home, you don't feel that it is a stranger's home, it's your own home. You become homesick of other people's homes. When you begin to understand the world from a philosophical angle, when you understand your own disciplines from an interdisciplinary perspective, when you ask yourself questions like, what does life mean in literature, in biology, in chemistry, in physics? Life means different things in each of these disciplines. And when you begin to listen to a biologist speaking about life, and when F.R. Levy speaks about life in poetry, life in literature, you begin to realize that, if you're very comfortable, if you love it, if you can enjoy it, if you're interdisciplinary enough to appreciate such connections, you become homesick. Philosophy is the wish to be at home everywhere. So there is no need to feel any homesickness, because wherever you are, that's your home. That kind of feeling that definition, can be related. That definition of philosophy can be related to this particular skill called the respectful mind. Now, how to develop the ethical mind? This is ethics in research, basically. When we talk about ethics in research, we're talking about norms, internal and external norms. Why do we need ethics? Why do we need to develop a sense of ethics? First of all, ethics constitute sound research practice. What is sound research practice? It is related to the quest for accurate, adequate, and relevant knowledge. Accurate applies to science. We don't deal with or deal in accurate knowledge. Adequate and relevant knowledge, academic freedom, originality, openness, trustworthiness. These are, trustworthiness is a result of accountability. So accountability is an ethical notion. We need sound research practices. No plagiarism. We have so many other. Then we need to regulate the research community. We need to remain, as people with integrity, impartiality. We need to appreciate criticism. We need to be accountable for what we learn, what we study, what we communicate, what we teach, what we impart to others. So if you look at this, you will realize that these are, in one sense, internal norms within the domain you're working, the field you're working. Regulate the relationship to people. This is what we've been talking about. Respectful, right? In all these, the earlier, skills, the ethical and the respectful, as Howard Gardner says, I could have thought of other minds like the digital minds and so on. There are so many other possible minds, but, he felt the need to include, respectful and ethical separately. But there are overlaps. Regulate the relationship to people. respect them, regulate the relationship to the rest of society. They are external norms. The first two are internal norms, ethical norms. The last two are external norms. And these are important things to keep in mind. Now, one serious ethical problem with our researchers basically is their unintentional plagiarism. The note takers triad, as it is known as, right? The three skills. All researchers, we paraphrase, we summarize, and we quote. And the way we do it, usually what happens is it becomes a copy. Paraphrase is actually capturing the essence, the idea, the main idea, the essence of something in your words, in different vocabulary, differently arranged words, and so on, with a different syntax, with a different, organization. Summarizing, so paraphrasing doesn't actually involve reducing. You don't worry about reduction of the passage. Whereas in summarizing, we try to capture the summary, main ideas, but we also make sure that it is less than the original. It is usually while paraphrasing and summarizing, these three skills are extremely crucial for research. It is when we do this that we become unintentionally, involved in plagiarism of some kind or other, some kind of, it could be, it's an unethical practice, a very serious, academic offense. In quotations, serious problems. Most of our students don't really know how to use quotations. See, I'm talking about learners, I'm talking about researchers, beginners. You might see, I always tell my students, please do not begin your paragraph with a quotation. That's not a universal principle. We see great writers beginning with quotations. Beginning a paragraph with quotations. I tell them, do not use, back-to-back quotations. Whenever you use a quotation, try to first contextualize and then try to, first understand why you really, quote that. What exactly is the meaning of this quote? Remember, these are not, if you begin to, for instance, if you read Aya Richards' The Principles of Literary Criticism, the first one, I think the first chapter called The Chaos of Literary Theories is nothing but a series of probably about 25, 30 quotations on what literature is from various writers, starting with Plato, Aristotle, and so on. We are not saying that such methods cannot be used. What I'm trying to say is that whenever we use quotations, first of all, we need to understand what that quotation is actually trying to say. Not a part of it, but the whole of it. If you don't understand a part of it, don't use it. But the parts that you use, you must make sure that you know exactly, you have understood. And then you need to contextualize it. You have to create the context for the entry of that particular quote. In order to do that, you need to know how this fits into what you've already been saying. And then you need to apply that quote, that central idea, to exemplify or clarify or explain a complication or demonstrate some point or something in your thesis. When you don't do it, it again becomes very, it's not useful when we do that carelessly. It gives the impression, people just take a number of quotes from different places and put them together, as some use it as padding. That's unethical. So you can talk about that, and with this we come to the end of this, but then we move on to some other fundamentals of research, and I think in the next 10 minutes I'll be able to wind up. We have already touched on these issues, but the question of what is creativity is important. Ken Robinson is an educational expert. He's published a beautiful book called The Element, where he talks about these three aspects. Whenever you are, this is what I mentioned in my brief talk on on reason for being, on Ikigai, the Japanese concept, I talked about aptitude. Aptitude, as you know, is a natural facility for something. It is an intuitive feel, right? Or a grasp for something, you look at it and you immediately understand how it works and how it uses. We have seen such people, youngsters, very young kids, who are very good at sometimes, uh, fixing a tap, or or repairing a particular mechanical gadget, some gadget, and so on. It means that I get it, I know it. I can say that I don't get it with regard to mathematics, but with literature, I think, I mean, with novels, with poetry, sometimes I have this feeling that I have some kind of aptitude for it. So aptitude is a very important skill, right? I mean, not skill. It's not a skill that you develop. It's something. It's a taste that we all have. That I want it is what we call attitude. And again, attitude is our personal perspective on the same problem. Right? It's our angle on things. Just because you get it, just because you love it, doesn't mean that you really want it. You may have a different attitude. Your disposition, your emotional point of view might be different. And also remember that many things affect our attitudes, right? Our basic character, our spirit, our sense of, self-esteem, the perceptions of people around us, and how we take the perceptions of people around us, when their expectations of us, and also how we understand luck and so on. Attitude is extremely crucial whenever we choose a topic for research. Do we really want it? And then, where is creativity? That question is, creativity is in a domain. I told you we are going to look at it at length. How can we produce a research or a research paper or a thesis or an MA, a master's thesis or a PhD thesis in a rather creative kind of way? How do we find or locate the sources of ideas? So these are three, important areas. Let's go. Creativity is often seen, especially by writers like Csikszentmihalyi, right? The authors on creativity, as like accidents, right? And it's interesting because when we talk about accidents, right, it's it's accidents do not happen just because one reason. Every accident is, in one sense, overdetermined. All these aspects are important. In other words, think about creativity as part of a system. Think about creativity on the model of a system. A system is something where a lot of things are already in place, but a slight, fluctuation in one level could cause a serious transformation in the entire system. The other driver could be responsible for this. For instance, today's, Dr. Babu was, he met with an accident, and luckily, because he maneuvered his vehicle towards the side where, there happened to be a wall. He hit against the wall. Nothing happened to him because he was very careful. He said that if he had done that, the other driver would have run straight into his car. So that was a narrow escape, but he did that. He in one sense sacrificed the vehicle almost completely. The front side is gone, but since he was alone in the car, that was not risky, right? The other driver is responsible for that accident. In the same way, when you get a brilliant idea, you never know whether you got it because you went for it. It often happens that the idea is given to you by somebody else, but you pass it off as your own, because if you hadn't been there, you would never have got it. The typical, alchemist kind of a concept, right? Turn as many stones as you can, and probably, if you don't give up, at one point, the last stone probably that you Remember that story in The Alchemist, where the alchemist tells the story of a man who believed strongly that there is some kind of a treasure under a stone, some kind of a gem under a stone. He started over and over and over. And finally, he was fed up. There was no treasure. He, curses himself. At that point, the alchemist says that he became a stone himself and rolled himself towards him, which he took and then threw in anger at another stone, which broke, and the gems were contained in that. I mean, in other words, somehow there are accidental aspects that actually, we know how, the primary content of what is called the tire, for instance. You must have heard about Dunlop, for example, the story of Dunlop. So there is this element of accident in creativity. So we are looking at creativity as a nested system. There are fields, there are domains, there are three. This is the way you need to look at it, right? There are domains of creativity, remember. You may not know what your domain, what your attitude is, what your aptitude is, without the right kind of opportunities. That's why people put a premium on luck. Because our attitudes or aptitudes do not become automatically obvious unless there are opportunities. A lot depends on opportunities. Opportunities that we create and the opportunities that appear to us, that come to us. Both are important. It's not simple, it's a very being creative is, that's why we believe that being creative is like being in an accident, right? You cannot explain a car accident on the basis of a driver's characteristics alone. There are too many variables. There are too many aspects, as we discussed. So what are these domains? What are these fields, and how do they work? I think, this will be my last slide, and we'll wind up here. See here, look at this. Creativity as a nested system. All of us belong to a particular family, but we do, of course, belong to a society first, primarily. Out of this society, we develop a family background of our own. And from out of that family emerges the person, the research individual, the individual who's doing the research. So since there is a society, there is a culture, right? Of course, in the society, there is a culture. In the family background, we also have cultures. I mean, we don't buy into everything, but largely we buy into the shared values of the society. And then this person, what he tries to do is he gets educated, and at some point of time, how does he start his education? He chooses a field. It may be literature. The individual chooses the field of literature. And from the field, he chooses a domain. You choose poetry or fiction or, theory or whatever to do research. So what happens is you're looking for, there are of course standards of selection that we use. The reason why we choose a particular domain. We look for new variations. There is the transmission of old information. See, when we come into the domain, in order to be motivated in the domain, you should actually love. You should have some kind of aptitude, and a positive attitude. And then you enter the domain. The domain has a culture of its own vocabulary, its own language, and so on. You're very motivated, you're very interested in that domain, so that you're able to, you have to learn everything that is already there. Transmission of all information is extremely important. But the purpose of your research is, of course, to find out possible new variations. So there is always, these are always nested, interconnected. So where exactly is creativity? Creativity is at the juncture. All these are important. the old notion that creativity is in the head of a person is gone, it's discredited. Creativity, the poet as that person who rolls on the ground during moments of inspired, divinity, that idea is no longer, valid. Just as everything is interconnected, just as everything in the world hangs together, creativity also is something that happens within a particular domain. If you want a philosophical understanding of this, a philosophical, beautiful philosophical, of course, complex deconstruction of the very concept of invention, research, creativity, read Derrida, Invention of the Other, where he talks about why invention is the only true invention is the uninventable invention. Because whatever you invent, whatever new thing you come up with, if the society cannot relate to it, if the society doesn't understand it, it's not considered an invention. We have so many things in history that we can today look back on with, fun and even a little bit of shame. A little lick of shame because you know what people said when Hoover invented vacuum cleaners. It didn't make much money out of that because nobody understood why you needed that, why they needed it. Nobody needed it. Just because you invent something new, it doesn't become an invention. It's not considered as an invention. It has to emerge from a field, from a domain, and then it has to destabilize the relationship in some way, alter the relationship in some way. In other words, for every invention to be proper invention, it has to be related to something that is already remaining within us. With us. It's already there. If you can't make that connection, there can't be creativity. So always remember that. Just as you have a culture within a society, you also have a certain culture within that domain. If you talk about, doing research in American poetry, there is a culture of American poetry. There is a certain culture. There are certain terms that you have to master, certain writers that you have to read, all of them, and so on. And it's only when you do that, an area of research becomes really challenging, begins to appear challenging. You can of course, synthesize. I know a friend of mine who, was topic of research at the University of Hyderabad, a few years ago was a study of all the critical works on James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. It is a study on Finnegan's Wake, but it is a study of it is called a metacritical study. It's a metacritical study, a study of the criticisms that are in existence at the moment. It's a beautiful synthesis of all critical views on Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. It's beautiful research, but there's nothing earth-shattering there. It doesn't change the culture. It doesn't change anything, actually, within the domain. It doesn't change the culture of the domain. It simply synthesizes available information and presents it to a particular domain. Every research is, first remember, presented before the field. There are gatekeepers of the field. You know what I mean if you think about how you write a poem. You write a poem and you never show it to anybody. You probably show it to your best friends, but you don't even send it to publishers. Because there are gatekeepers to the field of poetry who would decide whether it's a good poem. And some of us are scared of doing that. That's one of the reasons there is so much resistance to Turnitin, plagiarism check, and open source, Shodganga, databases, etc. Because we don't want the gatekeepers of the field to see what we have done. We would like to remain ourselves within that strict, our own domains. But remember, there's nothing, creativity is not just about coming up with something that is destabilizing the entire culture of a given domain. That is possible, that's extremely creative, but that alone is not creativity. There is something else too. Okay, so with this, I think I would conclude. And, yeah, a little, one more thing I want to say is this. there is this notion that research has these two dimensions, right? We have a field already. A field already simply means that something has been going on there. People have been saying things there. A conversation is ongoing. And there you go and say something. How do you say something when a conversation is going on? Just imagine, barging into a room or entering a room, let's say entering into a room where your best friends are having a conversation. You don't say something until you know what's going on. You need to understand what the ongoing conversation is about, what they say. And then, once you understand what they've been saying, once you read up on all the books that are available or on the topic, then you try to say something. Most of our research these days is actually produced without understanding what they say. And therefore, some of our own scholars think that what they say, as their I say, is something that nobody has said. All they have to do is to open some books to see that what they have said had already been said. In order to avoid that, we need to know what has already been going on in the field and in the domain that we have chosen. And then you can say, I say, that is why even in the latest 10th edition of MLA handbook, research is defined as a conversation. It's a conversation. You enter the conversation and you try to understand what other people were saying, and then you say what you can say, what you would like to say. That is the so the point that I've been trying to stress. I'll conclude. Creativity occurs at the interface of three subsystems within a nested system. First, there is an individual who absorbs information from the culture of the domain, right? And then changes it at least slightly, right? So that he can select that as a topic. From the relevant field, a topic, a change that is relevant to that particular field, so that gatekeepers can decide whether this particular research point needs to be incorporated within the discipline, or within the discipline, of course, the field. So what happens is the individual takes some information provided within the culture of the existing domain. And if the change suggested or brought about by the individual researcher is positive, is accepted by the gatekeepers of the field, it can change the set system, some symbolic system, the rules, the laws, etc. It doesn't have to be, your domain can be a finer domain. Poetry is a large domain, for example. If you want to look at poetry at a finer resolution, you can think of devotional poetry. And devotional poetry will be your domain. So domains are always nested in what we call a particular culture of that particular of a particular discipline. And we need to understand the symbolic knowledge. I told you about the important concepts in the field. And that is how, right? That is, so the first component in this nested system, in this system model of creativity, is the individual. The second component is, of course, the field. And, the field, the domain, and the creative individual. And creativity occurs when a person, using the symbols of a particular domain culture, let it be poetry, novel, music, engineering, whatever subject that we are talking about, whenever that individual finds a new pattern emerging, and when that is experienced as a novelty, that becomes a new idea, a creative idea. So creativity does not arise in the mind of a single individual. It is the result of an interaction of different forces that exist within this nested communities of three, components. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. The meeting is open to question and answers now. You may unmute your mics and ask, sir.
Thank you, sir. The way you describe this philosophy is very beautiful and wonderful, sir.
Am I still in the presentation mode, Kairali?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Can you stop my presentation from there?
Unless I have control of it, then I can stop it.
How do you get control? Because I can't. Yeah. I can. I think I can stop here now. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for that kind remark of appreciation. If there are any questions, I will be more than happy to engage. No questions? Did I take too long? Is it supposed to end in an hour or so? I mean, I don't.
No,
No.
no, sir, it's fine. Yes.
No, in my memory, it was 1.5 hours. So that's how I pasted that way.
Yes.
I think
was-
Abdurrahman told me that.
Yes, sir. Time management was perfect.
Okay, thank you.
I think that whatever you discussed, you provided much food for thought rather than questions. I think you actually through so many aspects to invite us to think.
Sir,
Are there any questions?
Sir, there's a question on YouTube where one Sudiksha Pai is asking, good evening, sir. Can a literature student do research on music?
Yeah, definitely. But, music falls under culture studies. And culture studies happens to be, part of literature now. Having said that, please be careful. Don't jump to the conclusion that it is how everybody thinks about it. In Central University of Hyderabad, they have a different opinion. Whenever a student goes to them with a cultural studies topic, they say there is a Center for Cultural Studies. Why don't you apply there? In some because Cultural Studies department, the Center for Cultural Studies operates completely as a different self-independent, as an independent unit in Hyderabad University. Whereas in Kerala University, the Center for Culture Studies, directed by Meena Pillai, is actually part of the department within the department. We don't have a Center for Culture Studies, but for us, fine. There is no problem with anyone doing research. And I remember a few years ago, one of my students worked on music. I think in Deleuze. It was an interesting study on the sonar territory of something. I think I don't remember, but one of our own students did that interesting work. So it all depends on where you are actually, because several departments, several universities, departments basically have a different take on this issue. Because the moment you bring in culture studies, I think culture studies is such a huge umbrella that you can literally bring everything under, almost all disciplines under it. That's why it is called, an indiscipline, because you can bring in any discipline under that.
So she follows on that question with what methodology can we use if we do research on music?
No, it depends on, it would always be better if you could relate to, relate your study to some literary works, instead of doing a research on, let's say, Beethoven or, some musical genius. It would be better. For instance, some of my students recently in their seminars, they were presenting, in the culture studies. I think they were presenting interesting topics, like, for instance, is Enjoy Enjami song. So, in one sense, it's about music, it's about songs, but they're trying to find an underlying, you know, social significance for the emergence of certain musical forms. So if you really want to work within an English department, I think it would make things easy for you to relate that to literature, to real literary works. That way, your proposal will look much better and, you know, much more relevant, because it's basically a question of the regime of relevance, as I call it. Within what regime of relevance can we include that study? If you say that you're working on the music styles in the 18th century in a particular country, totally unrelated, with absolutely no connection to literature, you know, probably your proposal might be rejected, at least by some departments. And even today, you know, in premier institutions also, there are certain prejudices with regard to research topics. Some people, especially old scholars, they think that research on James Joyce is really wonderful, but research on a minor writer who has just started recently, writing recently, like for instance about, you know, Jhumpa Lahiri's or Geeta Hariharan in India, is not really good. You know, there are people who think that research on Chetan Bhagat would not be a good idea. I mean, these are all perspectives. You know, in fact, one could do any amount of research on writers like, you know, Chetan Bhagat, because how they become the phenomenon of such writers, you know, such cultural phenomena are extremely interesting. So, yeah, when you adopt the methodology, I think is crucial.
So there's one more, few more on YouTube. PJ Thomas asks if a novel, sorry, please say a bit more about philosophy as homesickness and also mourning.
Yeah. See, that'll take some time. Philosophy as homesickness is the idea. See, what exactly is homesickness? Homesickness is the desire to get home. You know, it is because it is the idea, you know, in one sense, it's a kind of nostalgia, right? Nostalgia, the term is composed of two words, nostos and algos. Algos means pain, algia means pain, whereas nostos means home or homecoming. Nostalgia is actually the pain caused by the existence of an awareness that you can never go back home. The existence of by the awareness that there is a home, a better place to be in, you know, a place you would gladly be in, would rather be in rather than the place you are in. That's what is home. That's what homesickness actually means. The desire, right? If you read the novel Ignorance by Milan Kundera, for instance, it's a beautiful novel which begins with around 10 pages of discussion of this kind of nostalgia. You know, he explores this concept from a number of angles. One is Spanish, and he says that the title of the novel is Ignorance, and ignorance, as you read the novel, you come to realize that ignorance actually means nostalgia, because the reason why you feel you want to go home is because you're ignorant of what's happening at home. But if you're a true philosopher, that ignorance is liberating, because you know that you can never know what exactly is happening anywhere completely. You know, to be ignorant of what your beloveds are doing, to be ignorant of how your home, your one-time home, looks now, to be ignorant of people over there. That's what nostalgia actually means. But then, as a philosopher, such ignorance is taken for granted. It's there. So you're at home everywhere. In fact, if you give it a deconstructive twist, The very definition of homesickness is what destroys homesickness. Homesickness is a notion that militates against the very idea of being at home everywhere. It's the very opposite of being at home everywhere. Because if you're at home everywhere, then what happens is homesickness ceases to exist. So when you define philosophy as homesickness, what you're trying to do is to say that there's no need to feel at home in one particular place. If you properly understand the way the world works, if you properly understand that things in the broadest sense of the term hang together in the broadest sense of the term, you'll be at home everywhere. You'll be at home in Africa, you'll be at home in America, in India, wherever you are. You know that all these human beings, all these spatial configurations, all these places are just variations on the same theme. Mourning, philosophically, means, again, I don't know, how much time do I have, Anjana ma'am? Can I take another 5 more minutes?
Yeah. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So, what exactly is the work of mourning? I would like to, in this particular context, I'd like to quote a particular line about psychoanalysis from Julia Kristeva, who said that the end of a psychoanalytic treatment is a moment of mourning. Mourning, MOURNING, death and mourning. When you are going to a psychoanalyst for a treatment, the end of the treatment is a moment of mourning. What it means is simply this, that every treatment tries to transform the individual. A particular type of the individual dies. And death must be followed by mourning. And remember, this is what you understand. If you read Derrida's work of mourning, or even Spectres of Marx, in all this, the problem one big problem is actually mourning. Even in the pandemic that we are experiencing, one of the greatest pains of the pandemic, at least in the early days, in those days of horror, where, of course, that we were not able to mourn our beloved people who died without anyone mourning them. So mourning is actually coming to grips with a reality that is totally unacceptable. Someone close to you dies suddenly, and you go into mourning. According in some religion, it's about 9 days. I think the more, the better now. Psychologically, they say that the more, the better. Among Muslims, they have different views about it. Some Muslims don't spend any time officially mourning, but some Muslims have 3 days or 4 days. I think this difference is a result of the influence of the Hindu culture, because generally in the Hindu culture we have about 10 days of mourning. I think that's ideal. It takes about 10 days for human beings to properly acclimatize, themselves to their situation, to understand the pain, to get back their speaking power, their speaking ability. When a tragedy happens, when something tragic happens, we deny first, and then we feel angry later, then we go into bargaining mode, then depression, and then, the final stage is, of course, acceptance. So this is also something about any world, any kind of dislocation. You go into another world, and for instance, you go to another country, you feel homesick. Why do you feel homesick? Because there has been a loss, there has been a death. A place where you belonged originally has died. To a certain extent, it is real death. Now you are in mourning. In another part of the world, you are in mourning. You're going through a state where you need to accept the fact that you're no longer home at home. You're no longer at home at home. Think of Hanif Qureshi's experience of being homesick all his life from Britain about Pakistan. And finally, when he went to Pakistan, people treated him as a British guy. And, what he was longing for, the home he was longing for, was not there. So, a death is usually followed by mourning. And mourning is nothing but the process of coming to terms with a loss. In the case of homesickness, mourning is actually coming to terms, coming to grips with the loss of your own home. I think that's clear.
So there's one message in the chat box. Shruti Francis says, "Sir, thank you for the discussion." And then she asks, "What's your opinion in doing research in popular fiction, fiction less researched?" Sorry, she won't be able to unmute, so she's written that in the chat box.
Popular fiction.
Fiction that is less
I think
researched.
I think that question follows, comes on the heels of my remarks about Chetan Bhagat and the so-called, yeah. What is the question? Read the question. Is there anything wrong with that?
What's your opinion in doing research in popular fiction in apostrophes? And then she writes fiction less researched.
Yeah, I think, I think the whole category of what can be researched on and what cannot be researched. This is, what is the name of the girl?
Shruti.
Shruti, the question, relates to or harks back to a discussion, a debate that has been raging in the literary circles for quite some time. I remember reading an interesting article called "Who is Afraid of Sidney Sheldon?" This is about 25 years ago. The question was this. I mean, a lot of people are afraid of Sidney Sheldon. And I used to teach. I remember when I started teaching fiction, I had this habit of choosing, picking a a single page from the works of Sidney Sheldon or any such popular writers, you know, very beautiful, literally rich kind of, literarily rich, uh, um, uh, page will be picked up, a few couple of paragraphs will be picked up and, given to students to discuss and, even guess the author and so on. So in order to show that there is no difference between that. So there are different ways of answering this question. One is, you're you're basically talking about canon and canon formation, and is canon important? There is currently a trend of demystifying the canon, and I think the less uh, the less known popular fiction should also be made part of the study. I don't know if you're interested in this area. I don't know if you're familiar with Franco Moretti's concept of distant reading, the title of a book called Distant Reading, where Franco Moretti beautifully argues that the kind of novels that we are reading are actually chosen from a huge storehouse of novels. He says that the so-called novels in the Victorian period, the so-called canon, canon means novels that are considered to be good, considered to be worth reading. There are 200s of them on the list. But in fact, Victorian England produced 60,000 novels, which unfortunately, he says, never became part of the canon. So he practices what is called distant reading, where instead of reading these texts, he tries to find out it. This is actually what is called digital humanities, by the way. They use digital technology and feed thousands of novels, 8,000 novels into the system and try to understand how these novels, what changes have happened, titlings and different aspects of the novel, and so on. So the trend is there, especially in world literature, excuse me, in comparative literature, world literature. There is this trend, this importance being attached to the so-called, subjugated literatures of the world. I think it's a good idea. I really like it, and I mean, and if a scholar, if a student can come up with an interesting topic that's culturally, I mean, that is that falls within some regime of relevance. I think it's a project worth pursuing.
So there's one more comment and a question in the chat box. Niranjan S. Nair writes, even if you conduct research on nursery rhymes, it should meet some requirements of a thesis. What's your opinion, sir?
Say that again, please.
Even if you conduct research on nursery rhymes, it should meet some requirements of a thesis. What's your opinion, sir?
No, the problem is when you say thesis, what exactly do you mean? Do you mean a dissertation, or do you mean a thesis in the idea thesis in the sense of proposition? Because without a proposition, you cannot. Without a hypothesis, you cannot do research. Okay, so hypothesis is that idea that you you believe at the beginning of your research that uh, this this is what I feel about this particular area, and by doing research, I'd like to find out whether my thesis is null or valid. So, without thesis, without a hypothesis, which will ultimately lead to a thesis later, because hypothesis is what produces thesis capability later on. Thesis is an emphatic statement, a statement with a clear end, with a clear closure. Hypothesis, can become a thesis. So you don't need a thesis to start a research, but you need a hypothesis to start a research. And a hypothesis and thesis are different. You know, thesis is speaking in a certain way, in an organized way, right? The adjectival form of the word thesis is thetic, thetic thesis. So Kristeva speaks about the thetic break of a little child. A child, when do we start making complete sentences? Very late, much later. I mean, when we begin to learn language. But children do speak. At the age of 1, they speak. So the thetic break is a point in the child's transition, child's development, when the child begins to form complete sentences. In that sense, complete sentences are required, but they can be hypothesis, they can be thesis. Hypothesis is something that needs to be tested by doing research. Suppose you say that, let's say, this Enjoy Anjami song is the result of a certain series of events that have taken place within a particular culture, but you're not sure. You come up with this hypothesis, you state your objectives, and then you do your research, and probably you find that your thesis was wrong. I mean, you don't say wrong, you say null and void. So many such hypotheses can be null and void. I'm sure you've all heard about Einstein, Thomas Alva Edison failing in 2000 ways before actually coming up on the bulb. So they're all hypotheses that did not work. Null hypothesis that's known. If you do research in quantitative research, for example, like social sciences, if you do research, if you're doing an MA project and if your research finding finally is your hypothesis is null, still the research is valid, paper is valid. There's nothing wrong with that. You've done your research, you applied the methodology, but your hypothesis has been proven wrong. But if your hypothesis proved right, for example, you're doing a research on, let's say, the effect of Shakespeare's poetry on Wordsworth. That's a hypothesis. And then later you study all the works and come to realize that your initial hypothesis was misleading or probably proves to be null. There's nothing wrong with the research is done, right? But that has failed to produce a proper thesis. Thesis is an emphatic idea about if your hypothesis is proven right, then it gives rise to a thesis. So technically speaking, thesis must not be misunderstood as what we mean by dissertation, even though thesis means dissertation too.
So there's one more from YouTube. Ram Sebak Thakur asks, if a novel is recently published, how to deal with the literature review? Please help me.
No novel can exist in isolation on its own. Every novel is a product of a particular culture, historical moment, and so on and so forth. So if you think that a new novel has arrived, it is always new against a background, the backdrop of an old kind of writing. That's your literature review area. That's where you need to focus. You can extend what I said about the conversational mode of research. No work can suddenly appear as completely new. That is, as Derrida said, the non-uninventable invention. That doesn't happen at all. First thing, wait till you get at least a few reviews of the book before you start, before you decide to do research on that. Make sure that at least there are some reviews on the book, and then you can start your prepare your focus on that. Then you will have your tertiary sources. You may not have your secondary sources, but you'll have your tertiary sources. Use the tertiary sources as your basic literature review focus. That's what I ask my students to do, because it is much better, I think, than telling the students don't work on very new authors because there is nothing written on them. Why should something be written on them, right? And it's funny, very funny that research scholars sometimes work on one author from a continent, another author from another continent, and so on and so forth. These authors will have written other 20 books or 12, 10 books. They wouldn't even have heard about those books. So the face of research is also changing. It's not possible for you to take an author and focus and study all their works, and that I think is not possible anymore. But if you can't find too much material in the secondary research area, focus on the tertiary, research area.
So, so there is one more question, which is actually from Dr. P.J. Thomas of SV College, head of the department. And he has thanked you profusely for a good talk and happy to interact at least virtually. And he has posed, and apart from his earlier question on nostalgia and philosophy, he has posed another question. When everybody becomes researchers, teachers will disappear. That is UGC policy. Please comment.
Uh, Read the last part. First of all, thank you for your kind words of appreciation, sir. And please read the last part.
When everybody becomes researchers, teachers will disappear. That is UGC policy. And he has also added the tragedy of research today is that all do research and teaching as a skill is devalued and slowly disappears. So, with your immense experience abroad and here, what are your comments on this, sir?
I think we are sailing in the same boat. I think we are on the same page on this. I think even without research, good teaching has disappeared almost. Research is just, I mean, um, I like the idea. I like the dire prediction in his words. It's very much there. It's only a matter of time. On the one hand, there is this replacement of technology for teachers, technical gadgets taking control and making, at least for some students, from some people, teaching a much more humane process. I have this is a very personal kind of a view. I think probably Professor would agree. Think about 20 years back. If there was an English department, if there were 20 teachers, 10 teachers in that department, 8 of them would be extremely good, and 2 of them would be legends, at least one. What do we have today? Legends have disappeared. We don't have any one of them. Now, talking about the UGC plan, UGC's planlessness is actually the actual plan. It destroys, it doesn't sound like a plan, by the way, but it finally appears to us as a plan. Take, for example, the recent development as a result of the pandemic. Pandemic is, I don't have to tell you, transforming the very landscape of education in ways unimaginable, we never thought possible. Now, the recent news, as you most of you know, is that the 5-year contract is going to kick in. It is going to be, most of the authorities are very, very disturbed by the fact that teachers don't have to come to their workplace to work. So what does it say? Last week, for instance, in our university, there was all of us are teaching online, and those who really teach online, honestly, in a very, professional kind of way, they know how much more painless offline teaching is in one sense. But they think that we are having a free day at home. So the vice chancellor and the pro vice chancellor paid a visit to the campuses. They came to our campus too, and they were shocked to find that there were only heads of departments there. In some departments, the head was also not there. So you look at that tendency. That is the surveillance culture that's going on. That's very much there. And when does surveillance culture become very, very prevalent? When trust is low. And when is trust low? When professionalism disappears. When there is only systems without structures. Because trust is within the structure. When we know this is so, what really happens is 27 universities proposals for online courses degrees have been accepted by UGC now. JNU, several universities. UGC invited applications from different colleges. In other words, they can start online degree courses without the stigma of the so-called distance education. Online degrees are going to be same as offline degrees. Isn't that the beginning of a new culture? Isn't that the beginning of the end for teachers? Isn't that the beginning of the so-called the end of a particular species which is already endangered? And the better side of it is, do teachers really do what they're supposed to do in the way they're, I can, it's really funny. A particular teacher joins the department, any department for that matter, and she says that she cannot teach Wordsworth because she did research in music. But then if you don't want the salary, if you don't want the paycheck, then of course you can, she's forced to teach poetry. She has no connection with poetry. You spend years, this is the problem with research and culture studies sometimes. You spend years and years doing sociological research and come back to teach the wasteland. Either you remove wasteland and make it part of, like in other places, you give a course. I think this trend is going to last. I think this is going to be, if every university shifts to that online mode with most of their courses, and if teachers are offering those courses, specific teachers are offering those courses, then some kind of teachers, some species of teachers will cease to exist. I still remember in University of Hyderabad, Sharjah University, since you mentioned it, when I joined as the English language teacher of the university, I was the only non-Western, the only Indian teaching at the department. And after the first semester, I remember a man named Edward Black, we used to call him Eddie, a Scottish man, had no takers. He was asked to leave because no student wanted to study under him. They did not renew his contract. They told him to go. Suppose teachers start doing that in this part of the world, in India. I don't have to, complete that sentence. You know what can happen. So there are lots of disturbing things in the air, and all these ideas about the new education policy, by the way, which is supposed to be in place by 31st, 2031, 32. By then, I think a lot of universities would be here. Great universities, the so-called famous, world-famous universities, the Ivy League universities like Harvard and Yale, have not shown any interest. They've been invited several times, but they've shown no interest in coming over to this place. But MIT has started a branch of university in UAE. New York University has a branch in UAE. Masdar University is the UAE, version of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The salary is the same. In New York University, what you get at the New York University in New York, you'll get the same salary at the New York University in Abu Dhabi. The same salary, same salary. Teachers can move between the two places. The only difference is in UAE, you pay no tax. So there are several teachers coming over. They want to spend about a few years or so. It's all on contract. You are there for 2 years. Within the 2-year period, you're, in other words, contractual appointments are going to be, even this 5-year UGC, UPSC appointments. They say they pay you something like 75,000 for 5 years. At the end of 5 years, you can be removed from service. Or they can give you a raise and keep you there. Or they can keep you there for another 5 years for the same salary. You have no benefits, no perks, no pension, nothing, but probably 10 or 20,000 rupees more than the usual salary, starting salary. That's going to be the trend. And when that becomes the trend, you will not, this particular phenomenon of lifelong teachers will disappear. There'll be teachers who take a break, try it 5 years, and then try another. I have this very interesting experience in Sharjah University where some teachers who usually are above the 50s and late 50s, they were engineers. And then after they worked as engineers for 10 years or 20 years, they take a degree in teaching of English language, some TESOL or Delta or CELTA, and then they leave their country, go to other countries of the world, and they teach English for 5 years or so. If they like it, they continue, or they shift their career again. It is because of our permanent job, literally unsackable status of our job situation, that we stick to one job as a lifetime practice, even if we don't have any love for it, no passion for it, just because we are well paid. Something has to change, and something will.
So I think we can end, but just before that, I'll read out a comment in the chat box before I hand it over to Anjana ma'am. Amita writes, a fast-paced environment is what is now prevailing in the realm of academia. As you said, people are forced to take a research career even before they are ready for it, before knowing what they say to something as I say.
Yeah, I agree.
So with that, Anjana ma'am.
Life is very fast-paced, and one thing I'll add to this, since the to respect the questionnaire, because it's a very valid point that she has made. It's recent books, some recent books. For instance, the compilation of essays published as a book by Spivak called "An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization." She speaks about the importance of a non-coercive reorganization of desires. She says that the only way we can save the education system today is but through a reorganization, non-coercive. You don't force it on parents. She talks about on the part of parents themselves. There needs to be a non-coercive reorganization of human desires. It's a fundamental philosophical, shift that she's talking about. Because, and then books like The Slow Professor, for example, those who have read the book would have seen that's the picture of the snail. You need to bring it back. This is exactly what Spivak means by flexibility of imagination. It doesn't exist because we are too fast paced, and the science education system and the literature system is, they both are proceeding in the same on the same principle, right? That is one aspect of it. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you,
Everyone, before you wind up, I really thank everyone for your patient listening, and thank you, the organizers, for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
So I know you are in a hurry, but I would like to
No, I'm fine. Don't worry.
propose a few words
Yeah.
as thanks. It's a token gesture, but still, it has been a fascinating journey of discovery that we had during the past 2 hours. And you started with the importance of passion in whatever we are doing. I think that is a biggest thing, and you ended up with on a very tragic note that legends are a vanishing category in our profession. And in between these two observations, you began with quoting Khalil Gibran, and then you went on to speak about object order ontology. Then you spoke about how ego plus ignorance uh, becomes arrogance. Then so many vast and varied things you spoke about. Issues like how aptitude, attitude, domain, all these are very important. And I think all these ideas that you put forward and all the books and other things that you suggested, that will be of immense help to our researchers and all those who listen. And we are immensely grateful to you, sir, for this. And on this occasion, I would also like to thank our my guide and as well as Preeti, Dr. Preeti Nair, who is the coordinator, IQAC coordinator, uh, who, who, uh, who welcomed you. Our guide, Dr. Meena T. Pillai, she was the one who introduced us to you. And we are grateful to her also for providing us with this wonderful opportunity. So I thank the IQAC, then Prasad of Economics Department who did the live YouTube streaming, and above all, the two of my colleagues, that is Kairali, who is doing research with us, and Sree Devi, also of the same department, who helped us with all the technical side of this. And also, I think Kunhammad sir is a wonderful friend because he stepped in during an emergency when Babu sir had an accident, and I think that is the hallmark of his uh, character. And the first time when I went and searched about him on YouTube, I found a whole video which was actually uploaded by his students celebrating his birthday. I don't know whether you remember it. It was last year. And they spoke of him in such warm words. And apart from the theory, his knowledge in theory and the subject, and I think that makes him a wonderful human being. And we are all greatly indebted to you, sir, for finding time and stepping in last minute like this. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Deserves a special thanks for the rehearsal she did today, earlier in the day, and we really had to spend about 30 minutes on the rehearsal. I was such a dud in this Teams, and I think I'm thankful to